So, let's talk about what happens when a political promise gets tied to a ticking clock. It's a really high-stakes strategy, right? It's designed to grab everyone's attention, but as we're about to see, it can also backfire in a pretty spectacular way. I mean, think about it. What actually happens when a leader does this? When they start a public countdown, it forces everybody to watch. It creates this immense pressure, but it also puts all the stakes right on the person who started that clock in the first place. Because now, you better believe the audience is expecting a huge reveal when time runs out. And that's the heart of our story today. A dramatic ultimatum was made, a clock was set, and the public waited. But when the big moment finally came, nothing. Just silence. So what went wrong? And what does it tell us about the high-wire act that is modern politics? Okay, let's set the scene. Our case study kicks off in the middle of February 2026, right in the thick of Turkey's very charged political atmosphere. And it all revolves around this direct confrontation between the opposition and a brand new government minister. So on one side, you've got Özgür Özel. He's the leader of the main opposition party, the CHP. And on the other, you have Akın, whose appointment as justice minister was already stirring up a lot of controversy. Literally within days of Gürlek taking office, Özel decides to force a very public showdown. And look, Özel didn't just make some vague accusation. No, he claimed to have cold, hard evidence about the new minister's assets. He promised a detailed reveal, talking about it island by island, parcel by parcel. This wasn't just a political challenge. It was a promise of solid proof. And that set public expectations sky high. And right here, you can see the whole strategy at play. Özel makes this very loud, a very public challenge, and he slaps a firm deadline on it. And Gürlek's response? Complete silence. Now, that was a strategic move in itself, because it basically turned the spotlight right back around onto Özel. The entire political world was now just waiting to see, would he actually deliver? And that brings us to the moment of truth. The deadline arrived, anticipation was through the roof, but the promised bombshell, well, it turned into something else entirely. So Tuesday morning comes, and everyone is expecting the documents to drop at the party meeting. But it didn't happen. Özel then pushes the timeline, saying it'll happen this evening. That new deadline also comes and goes in total silence. By the time they have a big rally on Thursday, the whole issue wasn't even mentioned. You could just feel the momentum fizzling out with each delay. The political fallout was, you guessed it, immediate. Opponents and the pro-government media jumped all over it. They quickly framed the whole episode not as a failed attack on the minister, but as a total failure of credibility for the opposition leader. The whole narrative shifted from, what is Gürlek hiding, to, wait, was Özel just bluffing all along? Now, to really understand why this one incident landed so hard, we need to zoom out a little bit. Because for a lot of people watching, this wasn't some isolated event. It felt like part of a recurring pattern. For instance, let's go back to August 2025. Özel built up all this anticipation for what was being called a massive political bombshell. And while the allegation he eventually made was serious, a lot of critics felt it just didn't live up to the epic scale of the hype, creating this gap between expectation and reality. And just a month before that, during the Manavgat's investigation, Özel claimed he had 32 hours of footage that would prove a setup. He even challenged the president to a public screening of the videos. But that footage, it was never actually released to the public in the way he first implied. So you see the pattern emerging, right? It's this cycle of really high-voltage rhetoric and massive anticipation, which is then followed by a delivery that's either delayed or just doesn't quite match the hype. This leaves supporters kind of hanging, and more importantly, it gives critics a huge opening to shift the story away from the actual claim and onto the leader's follow-through. And all of this gets us to a really fundamental challenge for any opposition party. How do you navigate this incredibly complex dilemma of credibility, especially in such a polarized environment? Let's actually put a name to what we're seeing here. This is deadline politics. It's a powerful tool to grab the public's attention, for sure, but it is a classic double-edged sword. Because if you don't deliver when that clock hits zero, the whole conversation shifts away from the issue you're trying to expose and onto your own reliability. And this table just illustrates that gamble perfectly. Yeah, on one hand, you can totally command the media cycle and project strength. But on the other hand, the pressure to actually deliver is immense. And failure doesn't just mean you lose the argument. It can make every single promise you make in the future seem a little less credible. You know, none of this is happening in a vacuum. The Turkish public has a long memory for these kinds of things. A lot of people will remember the Cabotage incident back in 2013, where the government at the time promised to release video evidence of an attack that, well, never quite materialized as described. These past events create a pretty skeptical audience. And this right here is why this is so much more critical for an opposition party. A ruling party has all the levers of institutional power, they can control the agenda, but for an opposition party, their word is their main currency. Credibility isn't just a nice to have, it's their core strategic asset. Squandering it is a massive, unforced error. Ultimately, this whole thing boils down to one single critical skill in modern politics: the incredibly difficult game of managing public expectations. The challenge is really threefold. First, your rhetoric can't outrun your evidence. You just can't do it. Second, your timing has to be perfect. If you promise something for Tuesday, you gotta deliver on Tuesday. And third, you have to guide what the public expects, making sure that final reveal actually lives up to all the hype you created. So what happens now? Well, there are really two paths forward. The first is to release at least a verifiable core of those documents, something to prove the initial claim wasn't just a bluff. The second path? Change tactics. Maybe move away from these high-stakes countdowns that turn every single allegation into a referendum on your own trustworthiness. Which leaves us with one final question to think about. When a political countdown ends not with a bang, but with a fizzle, is it just the leader who loses credibility? Or is the real price actually paid by a public that becomes just a little more cynical and a little less trustful of anyone who promises to hold power to account?